Welcome to Right Now. I'm Anita, a passionate teacher exploring what could be different in education right now to better support everyone through a more human-centred lens. Today's guest is David Bott, bestselling author, wellbeing strategist, and co-founder of the Wellbeing Distillery. With a background spanning education, psychology, and system-level change, David works with schools, governments, and organisations to design healthier, more effective cultures. Before this conversation, David posed a question. What if instead of centring the narrative on teacher crisis, we studied teachers that are flourishing? It's a powerful shift towards a strength-based lens, noticing what's working and really amplifying it. David's own story reminds us just how powerful a teacher can be, how one educator's influence can shape lives. This is an uplifting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. David, welcome to the Right Now podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Anita. Nice to see you.
Yeah. David, I first came across you when you were speaking as a part of the Positive Education course through the Institute of Positive Education, and more recently through the Wellbeing Distillery. You draw on powerful research, but I'm particularly inspired by the deep and positive belief you have in school, how schools can be. And I'm curious, what sits at the heart of that for you? What's the purpose that drives your work?
Yeah, I never wanted to have anything to do with education growing up as a kid. In fact, when I was kind of 14 or 15, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life other than I didn't want to be a teacher and didn't want to be involved in teaching because I'd seen my mum, who's a career educator and PhD in education, found her own school. I'd see her wake up at 4 o'clock every morning, marking English essays, loving her job, but being so stressed all the time and kind of being exhausted by the role because she loved it so much. And I just thought this isn't worth it. And so I tried to avoid education, but I kind of accidentally stumbled into this work when I ended up in Japan teaching English. It's a story for another day, but as soon as I had the chance to kind of be in a classroom with kids and feel the impact that a teacher can have on the life of a child, I fell in love with this job, and from that point on, really, I've been fascinated by what it is that the best teachers in the world do differently to the rest of us. Like I as a kid, I had some amazing teachers that taught me. In my 15 years teaching, I had some amazing colleagues, and in the last kind of 10 years, I've had the chance to travel the world and meet with some of the best teachers in the world, and so I'm fascinated by what we can learn from the best teachers in the world, and I continue to see the impact that just one teacher can in a moment transform the life of a child. And it certainly happened to me once or twice, and we might get into those stories later on, but I fully appreciate that this is, I think, the most important job in the world, the most impactful job in the world, but also, as we'll kind of unpack, I guess, one of the most stressful professions on earth.
I'm fascinated about how you came to teaching. I think a lot of people would relate. People will say, you should steer clear of that profession. It's really hard. They've got a family member who's in it. But also what draws us to it as well, we can have such an impact, and the feeling of being in a classroom and having all those people that you can make an impact on is just so incredibly inspiring. And that's what draws us into the profession, I'm sure. There is a really strong narrative at the moment that teachers are overwhelmed and struggling, but many educators, as you say, are actually flourishing. And I love that you're bringing this conversation to the table. What are you seeing in those schools and classrooms, and what are the key ingredients?
Yeah, clearly, when you walk into schools in Australia, around the world, this crisis is real, and we're certainly not trying to devalue or dishonor the experience that many educators around the world are feeling of burnout and significant stress. The data is pretty clear that something like, depending on which data you look at, somewhere between 40 and 80% of professional educators are experiencing some form of, chronic or high level stress in their roles in an unhealthy way. So it is true that it is a very, very stressful profession. But what we don't talk as much about is that there are many, many hundreds, thousands in Australia, teachers who are flourishing, who absolutely love their job, who are turning up into this highly stressful environment and flourishing anyway. And really, that's that's what we're really interested in, not just studying the crisis, but also the opportunity, or trying to work out what it is that, enables some of the best educators in the world to flourish in spite of the significant stress. Last week I was over in Perth in Western Australia, and had the chance to have dinner and have a long conversation with one of the leading heads of school in an independent school over there. And he, a male head of school, has been in this profession for 30 years, runs one of the top schools in the country, and absolutely loves it. He is on top of his game. He looks younger than he is. The job is keeping him excited, and he's fit and healthy, and he loves it anyway. What I think what we fail to recognize is that the situation around a school leader or an educator has a significant impact on whether the job is healthy or unhealthy. Of course, there are individual factors. Of course, you and I, Anita, are different humans, and we respond differently to stress. But more important than that are the contextual factors around the educator that enable them to experience that stress as either kind of fulfilling and uplifting and growth orientated, or debilitating and harmful. And probably the three factors that we see that are most distinguishing or that are different in the teachers that are flourishing are, number one is relational trust. This is a highly stressful profession, especially if you're a leader. It's lonely as well. And when you have people around you trust, that is a significant buffer against the stress. And not only a buffer, but actually when you're experiencing a stressful thing together with someone that you trust, often that leads to growth at the other end. So relational trust is number one. Number two is psychological safety. Am I able to turn up to work in a stressful environment, make a mistake, and be okay? Or are people trying to get me? When I make a mistake, how will the community deal with me when I make a mistake is kind of the question we ask around psychological safety. And again, in flourishing educators, we see that they're encouraged to make mistakes. In fact, mistakes are celebrated. That's part of the learning, the craft, the profession that we're in, is that to grow, you need to be kind of pushing yourself and making mistakes. And so when there's psychological safety on top of the relational trust, you have this pretty powerful environment for growth. And the third factor that we often look at is leaders and educators who intentionally protect their energy. What we continue to see in this field is that high performance is not generated by working at a 7 or 8 out of 10 constantly. High performance is driven by oscillation, this kind of peak experience or peak energy output, an 8 or 9, where you're really switched on and you're delivering a keynote or a talk or a lesson, or you're having a hard conversation with a parent or colleague and you're absolutely switched on. And then there's this intentional recovery phase, micro recovery we call it, where you go back to a 4 out of 10 of engagement, and that allows the human to recover and go again. This kind of constant oscillation of 9 to 4 to 9 to 4 is what drives high performance, sustained health, and actually growth through a highly stressful environment. So they're just some of the factors, that exist around cultural factors, contextual factors that exist around educators that enable them to flourish in spite of it being a highly stressful environment.
I'm so interested in those three factors: the relational trust, the psychological safety, and the intentionally protecting your energy every day. It's something that, as all humans, we need to be talking about, because I think it's such a key, isn't it, to be able to thrive and work at a really high level, as you say. How does that look like from day to day for an educator, a leader? What do you see them doing really well?
Yeah, I think probably the one word to answer your question is intentionality. That pretty much every every leader in a school around the world that we see, they're good people doing really good work, and they're aware of this stuff. Like, it's not like David or the Wellbeing Distillery has discovered trust and suddenly we realize that trust is important in schools. Like, we all know that is the foundation of human relations, and education is a relational environment, right? So we haven't invented trust, but what we see in the best educators is an elevated level of intentionality around that, which allows them to exhibit the behaviors in a more constant and overt fashion, particularly leaders. So when leaders are role modeling, explicitly, intentionally role modeling relational trust and psychological safety and micro recovery, for example, then we create the conditions for the culture to shift, right? So our work is largely focused on strategy in schools, creating whole school systems that are strategic and systematic in terms of their focus on well-being. But fundamentally, we know that the culture eats strategy for breakfast. So strategy is important, but really the culture is what we're trying to build in a community like a school, which is a highly complex system. And the school leader, the school educator, everybody inside of that system has a role to play in building the culture. But the culture can only be built when we intentionally, constantly exhibit behaviors that we want to value inside of the culture. So that's probably what we encourage school leaders we work with to focus on is not only trusting their gut instinct, but also being highly intentional and strategic about the way they're role modeling trust, psychological safety, and recovery.
And I love the idea of intentionality. I guess a shared vision, a shared purpose as well. Would you say that's important too?
Yeah, when we work with schools in a kind of strategic capacity, we start with this question of vision. Actually, a lot of the highest performing organisations around the world, whether they're commercial institutions or military or whatever they government organisations, the highest performing long-term successful institutions always have a very clear, robust vision because humans are driven by vision. The ability of a human to paint a picture into the future, paint a picture of the future that we want to be part of is what really is at the core of human motivation, particularly long-term sustained intrinsic motivation. So if you're my school leader, Anita, and you are able to paint me this very clear, concrete vision of how the school's going to be better in 3 years' time and what it's going to look like and smell like and feel like, that's very highly motivational and sustains not only sustains not only human individual motivation, but starts to shape this culture because we're all moving together in this one direction to this one vision that we have in mind. And so we work very hard with school leaders to not just have a cute vision that's on a website that sounds nice on a marketing brochure, but actually something that makes teachers want to get up in the morning, makes them want to jump out of bed at 7:30 in the morning because they can't wait to get to school to be part of this vision that we're co-creating as a culture.
Absolutely. I think that draws me to my next question. You said that the most powerful wellbeing tool isn't a program, it's a shared language. And what does that mean in a practical sense for schools?
Yeah, shared language is arguably the most important impact that wellbeing education, positive education, positive psychology has had on schooling. I think, 15 years ago when I was teaching year 8 geography, there were still wellbeing programs and wellbeing professional development that was happening. Schools were always aware of pastoral care processes and programs. But what the science of wellbeing has brought to us is a very clear, evidence-informed, precise way to talk about mental health and mental ill-being and mental well-being. And when you have this shared language, it shifts the way people behave because not only do they have a very cool, precise, efficient way to talk about their own feelings, the feeling of others, and what's happening around them, but also it enables us to have a language that sustains kind of momentum. Like when we have a strengths-based focus in a school, or when we are aware of engagement processes or flow states in a classroom, we have this language that enables us to keep measuring, keep focusing, keep developing, keep growing because we're able to talk in a really precise, concise way about mental health and well-being. So yeah, the language is crucial to this. And kind of the way we often explain it is like a well-being program might happen on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:00. And that's nice. But wellbeing language happens in every single conversation. And this is when we have a shared language around the science of wellbeing, we start to move towards this goal of every lesson becoming a wellbeing lesson. Because not only is the grade 5 teacher or the year 8 history teacher, not only are they kind of teaching their content well, but they're greeting children in the same way. They're setting assignments in the same way. They're providing feedback with a language that's informed by the science of strengths, for example. They're setting up the parameters for projects which enable flow states because they have this framing and language around it. And so the language deeply affects the behavior of the professionals in the classroom, but also the students. And so we have this shift from just this ad hoc sense that wellbeing is a thing you occasionally do to actually wellbeing being fundamentally built into the heart of a school.
So it's the consistency, isn't it? Every classroom you go into, hearing similar messages. There's a routine. it allows for connection, a sense of belonging, but I also think it allows nervous systems to
Yes.
regulate through knowing what to expect in different environments.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
for
so
sure.
you go.
Yeah, I mean, we've got so much research now showing that when you elevate emotional literacy or wellbeing literacy, when you give the language of wellbeing and emotions, it enables us to understand our world better. You know, there's a whole field of psychological research actually called relational frame theory that kind of helps us understand that humans think in language. So when you elevate someone's emotional language or their wellbeing language, they literally think differently. They understand the world differently. And as you said, they can respond in a more adaptive way.
Mm. Do you think across a week, I'm just thinking on the spot here, that is a lesson a week along with a shared understanding of staff in the language as well? Or what does a good wellbeing program look like in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. When I was in year 7 and 8, I learned French for 1 hour per week. We had one lesson a week of French, and I quite enjoyed it. It was quite fun. And 30 years later, all I can remember is bonjour, ça va, croissant. You can't learn French in an hour a week, and you can't learn well-being in an hour a week either. You know, language is a fundamental, deeply complex thing. Learning, another language, and well-being similar. Like, these are really complex, nuanced human skills that we're trying to develop. So one lesson per week is slightly better than no lessons per week or no sessions per week. But really, when we see transformational well-being occurring inside of a school system, it's when every single human in the system is educated, is trained in this stuff. When we have leaders that are leading through well-being, through their setting of culture, through their their allocating of resource to well-being, through their vision and strategy. We see educators affecting their pedagogy so that every lesson is a well-being lesson because their pedagogy is informed by well-being. They've been trained in that. The students do have the opportunity to practice explicit skills of well-being. And then finally, the one part we haven't mentioned in this conversation that is arguably the most important of all is the families that sit alongside or adjacent to a school's wellbeing program. And often we forget about families and parents because they're not in a school, right? They're not in the building. The leaders and educators and students, they're in the building. Parents are not, families are not. And so we sometimes forget about them. But actually what we've seen, particularly in the last 10 years, is that parents, families, carers, they're what we call a force multiplier in the system. In many cases, not always, but in many cases, the parent or the caregiver has a much bigger impact on the well-being of a child than any teacher or school ever could. Like, my 10-year-old son, Hudson, goes to a lovely little primary school, government school in Melbourne, and they're doing a really great wellbeing program. And I'm sure he's learning a lot from it, and his teachers are being awesome. But then he comes home to dad, who brought him into the world, who literally taught him to say his own name, who loves him more than anyone else ever could, who takes him to footy, who's tucking him in bed at night. And I'm having a way bigger impact on Hudson's wellbeing than any teacher or school ever could. Hudson, my son, happens to have a father who, is kind of an expert in wellbeing science, but often many other families don't have that opportunity to be exposed to the literature and science and research that I've been exposed to. And certainly doesn't make me a perfect parent, but what it does enable me to do is to support what the school's trying to do. So I've got the same language as the school. So Hudson's hearing the same thing from me that he does at school. And this is where parents can become this massive kind of force multiplier in a positive way, when they're informed, when they're trained, when they're educated on what the school's trying to do. But also in the inverse way, a parent can be a negative force multiplier. They can, they can undermine all of the work a school's doing when the kid goes home to mum or dad, or the caregiver and the parent is dismissive of the wellbeing skills they're learning, or give a mixed message. So to answer your question, we have to have a systematic approach to wellbeing if we want to do this at a profound level and have long-term transformational change in a school.
I think as an educator, what I see is everyone really wants the same thing. Everyone wants children or young people to feel connected and to feel energized, to see their strengths within a school. And it can be hard at times to create that real community approach to education where everyone feels like they're sort of rowing in the boat together.
Sure.
When schools are doing that really well, what does that look like? What are they doing really well?
We've worked with over 1,000 schools around the world in the last 10 years. And I think maybe half of them have been kind of unsuccessful in terms of creating a sustained long-term impact. The ones that have been successful are the ones where there, as you said, there is a complete buy-in from the community that this matters. And it's often, the word we often use is kind of narrative. It's when schools get the narrative right around wellbeing, it drives this human story that this thing matters. That of course my son Hudson's going to school to learn to read and write and learn science and music and drama and PE and geography, and they're all important. Those academic skills, the knowledge of the world is super important. And we're preparing him for life, which is going to be hard. There's going to be ups and downs. It's going to be an undulating, crazy experience. There'll be struggle and trauma and difficulty and challenge and wonder and awe. And, I want Hudson to leave school equipped with academic skills to succeed, but also equipped with the life skills, which are arguably more important, but are certainly well entwined with the academic skills. So when schools appreciate the narrative that well-being is not a competitor to academic learning, but actually it augments and maybe supercharges learning. Once you have this narrative, that's really how we get buy-in, we get enrollment from every person in the community when they feel that wellbeing is not just the job of the wellbeing coordinator or the pastoral care people, but actually wellbeing is the job of everybody. And when we get this right, we end up with a flourishing community where kids are happier, leaders are better, more engaged, the teachers, there's less burnout, families are connected, and the child not only is better equipped to navigate the ups and downs of life, but actually they're learning better as a result. That wellbeing actually drives high performance learning as well as protects the child from mental illness and promotes mental wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so interesting, isn't it? How we get everyone in that same, on the same page together. And I do think as well, it comes back to, as you say, culture, but also shared language, which you spoke about before. It's just so important. It draws me to my next question. I've recently read your book, 10 Things Schools Get Wrong and How We Can Get Them Right, that you wrote with Jared Cooney-Horvath. You touched on some things as an educator and parent, but just really intrigued me. You explored evidence-based teaching, homework, failure, growth mindset, the 21st century skills, which you've just talked about, and grades, just to name a few. From the 10 things that schools get wrong, what do you think would be the top 3 priorities you'd put in place that we really need to be getting right at the moment?
I think perhaps the number one focus is really where we start this book, which is that, the very first sentence in this book about what's wrong with schools, the very first sentence is education is not broken.
Yeah, it's excellent.
I just continue to be amazed by what's happening, the wondrous work that's happening inside of schools. I see it with my own children. I see it in every school I walk into in Australia. Yes, there are some challenges. Yes, there are some crises. Yes, there's burnout. Yes, there's mental health issues in young people. Yes, that is all true. And there's some wondrous, joyous work happening. And I think, again, this narrative, that if I could shift one thing, it would be really the self-perception of educators to recognize that they are, in most schools we walk into Australia, we're walking into a situation where there are world-class experts in education inside of classrooms in schools in Australia. And that's true if you go to the local primary school or, the independent school in Sydney, wherever it is, we have these world-class experts. And we use that term very intentionally and very deliberately. I've been enjoying watching the Matildas, the Australian women's soccer team, playing in the Asian World Cup, or the Asian Cup at the moment, and going really well. And I love watching Sam Kerr and Hayley Rasso and Steph Catley and these elite athletes. Just brilliant team to watch. And they are highly trained, world-class professional athletes. They're considered that because they've done thousands and thousands of hours training. They're top of their craft. They're constantly refining their work. They're striving to be their best. They're highly coached. They're working together as a team. All of that applies to schools, but most schools, pretty much every school I've ever walked into, where we have teachers that have 10, 20,000 hours of practice. They're striving to be 1% better. They've got 3-year degrees. Some of them have 5 or 6-year master's degrees, PhDs. They're highly trained, highly driven, highly motivated, world-class experts in their craft. And in fact, many of them are more highly trained than the Matildas are. So in my mind, they are at least as world-class experts in teaching as the Matildas are in playing football, playing soccer, right? And this is the kind of the narrative we're trying to shift, that we want teachers to see themselves in that light. We want them to understand that they are brilliant in the work they're doing, that they're having this huge impact, and to not see themselves as kind of this second-class citizen where, in many situations, if you're at the local barbecue, there are doctors and lawyers and stuff who see themselves as top of this, highly trained experts in their own right, and they are. And teachers are absolutely up there. And because teachers do 1,000 hours of practice every year, 1,000 hours of practice every year or more, we end up with this really refinement of their craft in many situations where they are brilliant. So that would be the number one thing I would shift.
I've heard you speak about this before, and I just absolutely love your conversations about this. I love the way that you elevate the teaching profession. When I walk into schools, I have worked alongside exceptional teachers. I'm so inspired by the teaching profession and what people do and how much they care and how exceptional they plan, and they really, really want to get the best out of our young people. And I agree with you. I do not feel that it's always valued, and there are a lot of conversations that happen around education that really are damaging at the moment. And I just love that you are elevating the profession as I see it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a message you want to keep sharing. And when we share that message, I've never had an educator disagree with me and say,
Why?
Actually, I'm pretty rubbish. I don't practice and I don't care about my job. Like we something like 90% of educators choose this job because they want to make a difference in the lives of young kids. We want to, we desperately care about the next generation. No teacher chooses this job for the fame and fortune, right? We get into this job because we want to make a difference, and we are doing that, and that's the value that teachers add. This is kind of, we also talk about the invisible beauty of great teaching. Unfortunately, when Steph Catley scores a goal in the Asian, in the Asian Cup, everyone sees it, and there's a million people around the world see it. When teachers do their work, which is still performing, they're still performing in public, but unfortunately, the public, it's 30 kids in a classroom with closed doors, and so only the kid gets to see it, and they don't have access to the media, and that's not on social media, so we kind of have this high level performance happening in public, but only in front of 30 kids or 25 kids, which is a real challenge of teaching, is that this amazing craft isn't shared. And it's, we write about it in the book. It's one of the things that holds back this profession compared to professions like legal and medical profession, sports, where because outcomes are shared, the legal profession has their precedents, and the medical profession has their journals and kind of conferences where they're sharing a lot of best practice, or there's other doctors around while they're performing surgery. When teachers perform their best work, no one sees it, and there's no way really to share it, and no one really, so we have this kind of stumbling block or stopping, circuit breaker where best practice it's not easy to share it as an educator. And so we're working on ways to address that. But also the final thing I'd say is, there is a lot of emphasis, and I quite like the idea of visible learning and visible teaching and visible wellbeing, and there's some really nice ideas, and it works well mostly. But a lot of the best teaching is invisible. A lot of the most impactful moments are invisible. A lot of the most refined parts of our craft are invisible. And so sometimes there's an overemphasis on the visibility of great teaching, which also, I'll tell you a very quick story, if I may. Can I tell you a tiny story about Mr. Dean? The most impactful moment in my life, probably as a human, occurred when I was in year 7. I'd gone through a pretty significant traumatic experience where my father had come home one night and left a note on my pillow saying he's never coming home again. My parents just very suddenly split up when I was in year 7 as a 13-year-old kid. Hugely traumatic moment for me. I remember going to school the next day. It was the middle of winter, and my mum had evidently rang the school to let them know that I was going to be distraught or whatever. I just remember sitting in this year 7 business studies class with Mr. Dean, and I just remember the world being kind of grey, like the colour drained from my world. My friend Dr. Maria Sawa, who's a world-class expert in trauma psychologist recently said to me, you would have experienced a concussion, like an emotional concussion, with the same symptoms of a physical head knock. This just absolute trauma. My dad was my hero, and suddenly my world fell apart. I went to school. I was sitting in this business studies class. Mr. Dean set this assignment. We were learning about microeconomics or something to do with banking. Something. He set this little assignment, and I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what was going on. But he just walked up to me. I still get a bit emotional talking about it. But he just walked up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "It's going to be okay." And in that moment, that was I just remember. Like all the color coming back into the world. I felt like I could breathe again. It was exactly what I needed to feel, that the world was okay, that it was going to be fine, that there were people who understood, there were people that were going to be there, that knew what I was going through. And that moment of teaching Mr. Dean, that one comment really kind of reshaped my life, my world, set me back on track. And it really was the moment where I started to feel I could recover from something hugely traumatic. That's great teaching, and that's not written in a textbook. That's not, no one saw that. No one would ever have known about that, apart from I like to share the story. But that's the kind of the invisible beauty of great teaching that we don't get to hear about, we don't get to see about, but those events are happening all the time. Those events happening every day throughout Australian schools, throughout global schools, where teachers are literally kind of shaping the lives of kids in micro moments like that have profound impact on the lives of kids. And so this is where, I wish we were able to capture some of these moments, to tell more of these stories, to see the impact that teachers are having on the lives of kids every single moment of every single day.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That has made me feel really emotional as well, because it just highlights the power that a moment like that can have for one person, and how important that is in the trajectory of your life. It's just beautiful.
And teachers are doing this all the time. In fact, when I wrote to Mr. Dean about 10 years ago, and I stalked him on LinkedIn and said, do you remember Mr. Dean? Do you remember me? Yeah, I remember you. Do you remember this moment where you put your hand on my shoulder and said, and he wrote back to me and said, "Dear David, I don't, to be honest. I remember that was a time of distress for you. I don't remember that moment." And then he went on to talk about some other things. And when I got that response back, I remember being like so disappointed. I'm like, how could he not remember? Like, this is the most important moment in my life. But then pretty quickly I recognized that, he's doing that 3 or 4 times a day, probably. He's doing that all the time. That wasn't a magical, huge moment for him. It's just what great teachers do day in, day out. And this is why we're so passionate about allowing teachers to have the skills that Mr. Dean had, to intuitively have them, but also intentionally have the language, the framework, the skills, the planning that goes around that. And if we can harness the greatness of what's happening in schools, learn from teachers like Mr. Dean and share that, that's really what this work's about.
Yeah, there's a quote, isn't there? The kids don't remember what you say, they remember how they feel around you.
That's right.
Yeah, that relational, it's hard to teach it, that connection, but also that presence that Mr. Dean had in that moment, just to be, hold space for you, is just incredible. Yeah,
it is. And I think it's one of the things that distinguishes, expert teachers from novice teachers is, novice teachers can kind of manage the room, but expert teachers kind of read the room, and they can understand the worlds of these 25 kids. They get inside their heads.
I want to change directions slightly now. In schools at the moment, there is quite a focus on testing, standardized testing, grading. You speak about grades in your book. I'm interested, if teaching is more than just increasing a student's rank or grade, what is it really about, and what should we be measuring or noticing instead?
I think particularly high school, what we see is that education is played as like a finite game, where there are rankings and ATAR and league tables, there's winners and losers, but really education is an infinite game that never ends, that we're constantly trying to grow and evolve as humans, as people, as young people, as schools. And I think the best schools in the world, unfortunately, the best schools in the world are ranked by the wrong things. We still rank schools based on ATAR and grades and rankings and stuff. But the things that kids value, the things that teachers value, the things that parents value are often different. Like we've got this question that we ask parents around the world, which is, in 2 words or fewer, what do you most want for your child? In 2 words or fewer, what do you most want for your child? And it's a beautiful question. And actually, to be honest, Anita, a really boring question, because every parent answers the same way. They say, we want our kids to feel engaged in life, we want them to be happy, we want them to be motivated, we want them to be making a difference. They say all these things. Every parent says the same thing. Not a single parent, we've asked this to thousands of parents around the world, not a single parent has said high ATAR or get into Harvard. That's not what parents want for their child, is their child's growing from a child into an adult, like the role of the school to guide that trajectory. And if you ask teachers, like, what's the role of education, what's the role of school, none of them say get kids into college or get kids into uni or to maximize ATAR. No teacher ever says that. And in fact, no student, my mum's PhD was fascinating. She collected the letters that students write to teachers at the end of a school year or end of a term. These little hand-drawn, handwritten little scrappy piece of paper that says, Dear Miss Anita, thank you for teaching me whatever it is. And these are beautiful piece of data because they're unsolicited. No one's forced them to write this. It's kind of the outpouring from a child's heart. My mum collected thousands of them from around the world and analysed them and compared them to compare what students say about their teachers to what kind of the common discourse is around teaching and education. And as you can imagine, there's a pretty big gap between how the media, how the general populace kind of talks about teaching and how students talk about their teachers. In those letters, there were thousands of them, not a single one mentioned grades. They are all, thank you for helping me feel safe. Thank you for helping me feel that I matter. Thank you for helping me feel seen. Thank you for spurring a love of poetry. Thank you for being there for me when no one else was. That's what the kids wrote. Not a single one mentioned grades. So we have this weird situation where no student, no parent, no teacher really thinks about schooling in terms of grades, but we have this pervasive structure, systematic structure that rewards schools for high grades. And, and I think there is a big disconnect there that's starting to be shattered. There was a fascinating paper written a couple of years ago now called Beyond the ATAR in Australia, which is a recognition during COVID, seeing what was happening around Australia, in the US, around kind of the collapse of the traditional student entry pathway into universities. That's increasingly starting to shatter a bit, particularly with AI, particularly with the impact of social media, particularly with kind of apprenticeships being offered, particularly with students, young kids being able to sit in their bedroom and create businesses from scratch. And, so there's a big shift. And so we're starting to recognize more and more what schools, what teachers, parents and students have always known is that, this kind of stuff we call 21st century learning skills, maybe like collaboration and cooperation and teamwork and empathy and kindness, those things that we say we value, those are the same things we currently call cheating in a test or an exam, right? Collaboration, like we call them. So we say we value them, we don't really value them, but they're starting to be really valued now. And so I think there is a shift coming where there's pressure from all sorts of fields to really value the most important human skills, which is really what the wellbeing science is about, is trying to understand what skills enable humans to flourish. And that they're the skills we really want to be teaching at schools, as well as with math, science, coding, and the other kind of academic skills. We need to be teaching these skills for life.
It's so exciting to hear about this. I love your conversations about this. Unlimited resources. What do we do? Where do we focus our energy? There's a disconnect with what people are wanting out of education and what they're getting. Where do we start?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to sit on the Dubai Future Council for Education, where we had the chance to think 70 years into the future of education in the UAE and try and map what that might look like. And so sitting around some of these amazing brains from all different walks of life, trying to think about this, I think where we get to is that there's and this is already happening, is kind of a breaking down of the walls. most schools in Australia, again, have a big kind of brick wall between that separates them from the community. And we say, community's out there, schools are here. Those walls are starting brick by brick to be broken down a bit. We're starting to see more and more integration into the community where, instead of just doing like work experience, it used to be called when probably you or me are at school, now there's constant interaction between the community and the schools. I was out just last week at Brimbank Tech School in Melbourne here, where they're building this brand new high-tech school, where there's, they're literally on the phone to Qantas, to Melbourne Airport, where the students are engaging in this project to help develop new technology for Melbourne Airport. Like, there's this, it's almost like the school didn't exist. The school is just this conduit between these 14-year-old kids and Melbourne Airport and the kind of high-tech engineering that's happening there. And so schools, already we're seeing examples of schools, instead of being this kind of ring-fenced, brick-walled environment where we teach kids algebra, actually we're seeing schools become conduits to real-world skill development. So that's where I think there's this fascinating kind of shift already happening in front of our eyes, and it's going to happen quickly. And that's where I think the well-being skills, that people sometimes think about well-being as just like gratitude and empathy and mindfulness, and it is those things. But actually, it's also about high performance and high engagement states, and high performance goals that drive motivation, human motivation theory, behavioral economics. Like, there's so much associated with well-being science that's about engagement and performance and optimization and productivity, as well as those other kind of softer human skills as well. So that's, again, part of this narrative we're trying to shift, that wellbeing isn't just about being kind and nice and pretty and hugging trees. It's also about fundamentally understanding human high performance as well.
High performance and contributing to the community, contributing
Correct.
to something else bigger than yourself. I love the idea of, breaking down the walls and getting out into the community and seeing how we can connect with people to give kids opportunities to develop those skills within school time. It's just so amazing to hear this. And to think 70 years ahead, like, how inspiring to be in that conversation.
Yeah, it's amazing. And obviously kind of very blue sky and in some ways very unrealistic and untethered to reality. How could we possibly know what's going to happen in 7 days, let alone 7 years or 70 years, time. But it's helpful to try and think what might be possible, to maybe try and accelerate some of the opportunities, rather than kind of just dragging along and waiting for things to unfold, that education can be on the front foot. And schools like Brimbank Tech, I think, in Australia are starting to do that, to really push the envelope, really to ask, what is the purpose of school? It's no longer just to teach reading and writing, because you can, during COVID, my son learned to read and write from home. He didn't need to go to school to learn to read and write. So schools are not about reading and writing anymore. They've got to be something more profound than that. And I think what we're recognizing is schools are fundamentally about bringing young humans together to learn to solve interesting, important problems. And when we kind of recognize that that's the purpose of school, then we have these amazing kind of deep connections to the real world, to meaningful things, so that we're not just teaching kids about how a river is formed because it's on the test or on the geography curriculum, but actually so that we can make a difference to the lives of people who are struggling in flood, when a flood comes. And there's this genuine connection to real world events, and the real world impact is what really inspires young humans, I think.
Oh, it absolutely does. That real world experience where you're thinking about, problem solving and being curious and solving real life problems. I'm just so inspired to think about how we can do that more in schools in the future. For teachers who might be questioning their confidence or capacity right now, what perspective would you want them to hold about their work?
Yeah. Firstly, I'd say that doubt is not the opposite of competence. Being overly competent or overly confident, actually, overly sure of yourself as a school leader or an educator, in our experience, is actually a pretty harmful state to be in. Often it's the kind of mediocre teachers, the mediocre, average kind of leaders that think of themselves great or finished or complete or masters of their craft. The best teachers, by far the best teachers in the world, are the ones who realize that the more they practice their craft, the more they have to learn, the more questions they have, the more opportunity for growth there is. Consistently what we see, like one of the paradoxes of great teachers, is that the best teachers are the ones that are working twice as hard on their craft, because they realize there's so much growth to occur. And, which I think is awesome. And it's probably the same in sports as well. The most elite athletes are probably the ones training twice as hard, because they realize they can get better and better. And so I want teachers to recognize that doubt isn't the opposite of competence. And probably the second message is that, and I'll tell you a tiny little story again, kind of just to preface this, that I worked with a Scottish teacher when I was working in London in the UK. And I was having a conversation, morning tea one time, and I said, teaching's hard work. And he said to me, and hard work. I'm like, that's what I just said. It's hard work. It's good with his Scottish accent. Hard work. No, not hard work. Heart. Like he's pointing to his chest.
Yeah.
It's hard work and heart work, which I loved. I've held on to that because we kind of see that teaching is identity work, right? So you're kind of teaching yourself. So when things go wrong, it sometimes feels like you're the mistake or you're not good enough as a teacher, because so much of our heart is connected to what we do. So we want teachers to recognize that, yes, you should be 100% invested with your heart. But when things go wrong, it's not because you're not good enough as an educator or as a human, but actually you've still got opportunities to grow your craft, to work on your craft. I think we want young teachers, emerging teachers in the middle of their career, at the end of their career, to be constantly striving for ongoing development and growth. We intentionally use the word craft because it's not something you ever master. This gig, I've literally interviewed the American Teacher of the Year, Australian Teacher of the Year, UK Teacher of the Year, the New Zealand. I've interviewed and spoken to the best teachers in the world, and they're the ones who recognize more and more that they got more work to do. Like, it is not something you ever master. And so if you're having doubts, I think recognize that's actually probably a good thing. It probably means you care a lot and you're probably doing the right thing to be striving. But the last thing I'd say about this is my very first supervisor when I was doing my teaching rounds, we used to call it back in the day, when I was an undergraduate teacher, and you'd go out to the school for a couple of weeks and practice what you're learning at uni. And before I was a qualified teacher, my first supervisor was this guy called Andreas. And my very first lesson I ever taught was at this little school in Melbourne, high school. I taught a year 11 psychology class. And I was really excited and keen, and I'd prepared it. And I think it went okay. But I don't know if you remember back to your early teaching days, Anita, but the first lessons you teach are never great. A little bit like when you're learning to drive a car. You're not really a good driver. It takes a long time, right? So it went okay. That first ever lesson I taught, it wasn't great. It was fine. There were some nice little bits. And afterwards, Andreas sat me down, and I was ready for he's a nice guy. I was expecting him to say something nice and then probably give me some feedback, and then maybe like a compliment sandwich I was kind of expecting, right? But he sat me down, he put a piece of paper in front of me, and he said, write down what went well. And I wrote something like, some good connections with kids, and I felt like they had fun, and the lesson ended on time. It was a few little things. And he just gave me a high five, got up and walked out. And that was it. There was this recognition that, as the things go well in every lesson and things go wrong in every lesson. And I've learned a very powerful message that day to focus on strengths, to recognize I'm not going to be perfect. But when we have this strengths focus, and not to say we're ignoring weaknesses, but have a strengths focus on really emphasizing what's going well, where our talents, where our assets lie, and really emphasizing that. The next day, I couldn't wait to come to work that next day. And the second day went okay as well. But there was this constant recognition that I'm doing a lot of things right, and there are some things to work on, but mostly it was the things right that were going to drive me and fuel me throughout my career. And so I think having a strengths-based focus, not at the expense of weaknesses, and not if there's something really going wrong, of course we need to manage that, but having this emphasis on focusing on what you're good at, where your strengths lie, is a really helpful way to help the whole profession move forward as well.
I love the strengths-based focus, but I also love, the personal responsibility that, you need to write down your 3 things that you did well, and off he walked. Like,
yeah, that's
no
right.
feedback on that.
Yeah, exactly. So And we see this in the literature as well, that
Yes, we do.
strengths-based feedback significantly enhances growth and development post-performance compared to weakness or deficit-based feedback. So there's multiple studies recently showing that. So I think it's not only a kind of a nice positive psychology way to think about it, but it's actually informed by the science, which suggests that deficit-based feedback is ego-threatening and causes this kind of defense mechanism rather than learning mechanism, whereas growth-based, strength-based feedback provides this opportunity to learn, especially when it hasn't gone great. When it wasn't perfect, and then someone gives you some strength-based feedback, your brain's in this prime learning mode where you're ready to learn, and you're provided with this ego boosting or kind of self-efficacy boosting opportunity to grow through your strengths. So I think that's an amazing evidence-based way to help teachers to grow.
Move their craft forward. Yeah, absolutely. This has just been such an uplifting conversation. I absolutely am so grateful for all the work that you are doing, but also for the positive lens you bring to education. You're very honest about the struggles and the challenges, but also you see schools that are really, really thriving. And it's just so nice to hear those stories as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks for your work, and thanks for allowing people to have a voice and to share some of the amazing work that's happening in education. Appreciate you. So thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I left this conversation feeling inspired and full of possibility. David's insights are practical, they're thoughtful, and his strength-based lens is really energising. But what stayed with me most was his willingness to gently challenge the narrative around struggling teachers while also acknowledging the complexities of the role at the moment. The episode really had it all: emotion, passion, humour, and just an honest exploration of what's possible in education when we shift the lens. I'm incredibly grateful for the way David approaches his work with clarity, care, and a deep belief of what's possible for educators and young people. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Thanks so much for being here.